I thought we were on. All right, we're live and recording. Hello, NaNoWriMo. I'm Grant Faulkner, Executive Director of NaNoWriMo, and welcome to our special Friday finale webcast for our fundraising campaign for the Young Writers Program. And we're very fortunate today because we have the wonderful writer Marie Lu with us, who, beyond being the author of such fantastic YA fantasy classics as the Legend Trilogy and the Young Elites Trilogy and the recently released The Kingdom of Back, she's also a NaNoWriMo board member. So, and thank you so much for joining us, Marie. It's wonderful to have you here. And I should say also that Marie wrote with NaNoWriMo as a teen, and she's given this fantastically generous matching donation of $5,000 for us this week. And we've hit it thanks to the generosity of you. So thank you so much, Marie. Thank you so much to NaNoWriMo donors. I'm always just so touched, and especially now because this is a super tough time and we're all really anxious. And NaNoWriMo's programs are honestly more important than ever. We saw this last spring. When we went into lockdown phase and schools started closing, a lot of parents, teachers, and kids, they really didn't know what to do. And we were there for them. Our servers were going crazy with traffic. And we started this program, Stay Home Rimo. And the reason we were set up for this is because our Young Writers Program really is about distance learning in a way. We never thought of it like that so much. Everything's available online. You know, teachers can set up online classrooms, and students can write on our online writing platform, and they can gather and form community and talk about writing. So anyway, we just felt like it was more important than ever, and that's why we're holding the fundraising drive for the Young Writers Program now. And thank you so much for all your donations. I know it's a tough time, and so thank you so much for donating. And I just want to give you some little-known facts about the YWP program, because I think we talk so much about NaNoWriMo that sometimes people don't know about the Young Writers Program. And 35% of the schools who participate are Title I schools, and that means they're low-income schools. So it really fulfills an important need there. 52% of our young writers are writers of color, and that's a lot of writers because in 2019 we had 97,211 young writers who participated, and about 10,000 teachers. And just to give you an idea of that, put it in perspective, that's the entire San Francisco school district includes about 60,000 students. So that's a lot of students, excuse me, for a tiny nonprofit to support. And we can only do that with your donations. So thank you so much. And I know, sorry, I'm going to have a little glass of water, a little drink of my special NaNoWriMo coffee.
Yeah, it's been an honor working with you guys. I think it's a testament to how well structured NaNoWriMo is and how effective you guys are and how generous everybody who's involved with NaNoWriMo is. So
that's it. They're so generous. It's just a wonderful community, including you, Marie. So thank you for joining us. I know everyone's eager to tap into your writing wisdom, and I read so many great messages in chat. Sorry, this is like ill-timed frog in my throat. But I'm going to show off the NaNoWriMo mug because it was
love it.
Yeah.
I love this chat stream, by the way. This is so fun.
Yeah, I know. I wish we could just sit and read it.
I know.
But I do want to thank everyone for submitting such fantastic questions. You know, I sat down today to write this interview up, and I was like, I don't really need to do anything because there are all these fantastic questions, and that's basically what I'm going to ask Marie. And starting with, just so people can get to know you, Marie, tell us a little bit about your writing journey. How did you start writing? When did you know you were a writer? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess this is kind of like an unofficial part of my journey because I didn't really know what I was doing, but I started writing when I was around 5. That was the age when I came over to the States. It was like 1989, and my parents and I settled in New Orleans, Louisiana for a couple of years, and I didn't know anyone. I didn't know English. My parents didn't know English, and like my first American experience was Mardi Gras, which was
wow.
2 months in, and we're like, let's go see what Americans do. Mardi Gras. We're like, what is happening? So it was really fun and weird and scary. And I remember my mom giving me an assignment to go to kindergarten every day and write down 5 English words that I didn't know and come home and look them up in the dictionary and then put them into sentences. So that was kind of how I started writing. And then over time, I realized, like, once I had enough words to know what to do with them, I just realized I enjoyed that process of writing these little paragraphs. And I, you know, at the time my mom was working at like a local restaurant. And so I would go with her and during the summers, and they would just they put me in this like little broom closet, and I say like it was a nice broom closet. It wasn't like a like a terrible place. It was, they had like a little tiny TV and like a little couch, and I would just stay there while I was waiting for my mom. I would just write little stories for myself, and that was, I think, when I really started to enjoy the process of telling stories. And I had all kinds of little stapled together stories from that, when I was growing up, and I would write all kinds of fan fiction of my favorite things. I wrote like fan fiction of video games and fan fiction of my favorite novel series. And but it wasn't until I was 13 that I realized that real people wrote books. Like, I don't know where I thought books came from. They just fell from the sky. But when I was 13, I read an article in the paper about this 13-year-old girl named Amelia Atwater Rhodes, who had gotten her first book deal. And that was the moment when I was like, oh my God, real people write books. And also she's the same age as I was at the time. So I was like, oh, maybe I can write a book. So that was when I got more serious about it. And I was terrible at it. Like, I wrote this, I was 14. I wrote this like terrible fantasy novel that was basically a Lord of the Rings knockoff. And I started sending it off to agents.
All right, good for you.
And
you're enterprising.
It was terrible. I was like, this is great. But I look back, I'm like, oh God. And it got like 100 rejections. Like it didn't go anywhere. But that was kind of like my first, attempt. And at that point, I wrote, between high school and college, maybe like 4 or 5 manuscripts. I never got anywhere. And while I was waiting for rejections on the 5th manuscript, that was when I was writing Legends, and that one was the one that sold. So it took like overnight and 12 years to get to that point. So,
and some of those drafts or some of those early novels were written during NaNoWriMo, is that right?
Oh yeah, I nanoed all of those. Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. I still feel like I nano basically every month now. But,
it's a lifestyle.
But it's like you learn those skills early, and they apply really well to now as well.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love it. I love how enterprising and how ambitious you were as a very young person. And this question comes from Kenna, and she wondered, what is your favorite improvement that you've made as a writer since you were a young writer? I thought that was such an intriguing question. What is one thing that has improved?
That's a fantastic question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before.
Yeah, I haven't either. Wow, I'm going to use it. I'm going to steal it, Kenna. Sorry.
Yeah. Gosh. When I first started writing, I was very piecemeal. I would start writing a draft without any kind of prep whatsoever. And I would just kind of dive in and write myself into corners. And I think now I've kind of streamlined that a little bit better. Not to say that the books have gotten easier, but I feel like I have a better roadmap for figuring my way out of, the swamp of the middle. So I have a more streamlined process of like figuring out my characters and everything that I can possibly know about them, and then going into outlining. And so I have like this kind of set process that I go through now with most of my books. So I guess that's kind of an improvement, but to be honest, I feel like every book is a completely different beast. And even though I feel like I've learned more to like tricks in how to get myself out of those things since I first started writing, every book is like a panic, a 9-month period of panic where I'm just like, I'm never gonna get there. And I think maybe the biggest improvement is that I've just learned to recognize that feeling and know that this is a temporary feeling, and that someday I will reach the end of this draft, just like I've reached the end of the drafts on many projects since then. And so I'm in a better mental state when I'm writing first drafts, because I hate writing first drafts. Like, that is just my absolute least favorite part of the process. So that I think helps propel me forward more now so than it used to.
That's interesting, and I'm hearing just a little bit of an echo. So if I'm late in my delayed question or something, that's what's happening. But I think it's really interesting for a writer too, that the thing you learn is not necessarily about what's on the page, but trust, believe in yourself, your ability to recognize those emotional parts of writing. And that's what I think, I like to think NaNoWriMo contributes to that for people as well. So thanks for sharing that. One thing I was intrigued with your bio is that you worked in the video game industry, and the video game industry is so much about narrative. I'm curious if that influenced your writing in any way.
Yeah, I think it did. I worked as an artist in video games, so I wasn't really on the writer side of it, although that's something I would love to do one day. But I think working in an interactive story environment was really interesting for me. And at the time, I was an aspiring writer and getting rejected. And I was feeling kind of, I went through this 2-year period after college where I didn't write at all because I was kind of down about the whole thing. But working in games kind of brought back my inspiration for writing. And it was because of watching the way that games were constructed and how this team builds this entire 3D world around a story, and that it was interactive. That's the main difference with video game storytelling, is that you as the player can get to choose your path a little bit. And I found that very inspiring. And I think that it has kind of changed the way that I look at how I approach the way that I structure my stories in my novels. And I find myself thinking back on a lot of the things that I saw while working in video games and putting in those types of like narrative beats in some of my drafts. And like when I'm writing now, I literally picture a 3D environment when I'm, sketching out a scene. And then in Warcross, which is actually about video games, it was quite literal. I took pretty much everything that I remember from working in games and inserted that into this novel where I had no budget to restrain me and could make the craziest game of all time in it. So I would say it influenced a lot of the way that I think about narrative, and most of all gave me the confidence to go back to writing and to remember that being creative is not something that you grow out of, and that it's something that you can do as a profession. It's something that you can surround yourself with. And I think working in an environment full of other creative young people was very helpful to me in that sense.
Yeah, that's cool. This one comes from RBS, who says, I love to write and want to write a novel, but I don't know what to write about. What tips can you suggest for generating ideas for plots? So I'm curious how you get your ideas, how you decide they're an idea to commit to, which I think is kind of interesting, and then how you develop the plot.
That's a really interesting question too. And I think it's a little bit different for everybody and how they come up with ideas. And I'm pretty sure the person asking actually has a ton of amazing ideas swimming around in their head. And mostly it's about structuring it into something that resembles a story, because everyone has a story in them. You've experienced all the things that you've experienced in your life, everyone that you know, everywhere that you've been, all of that is fodder for a story. So I think it's more about thinking about what kind of storyteller you want to be. Is there a general category of story that you find yourself drawn to reading? Like, for example, for me, I've always been drawn to science fiction and fantasy. Like that was my house. Like when I was growing up, that's where I lived. And so I tend to think of ideas in a science fiction and fantasy bent. And everyone's mileage varies. Some people lean towards contemporary, some people lean toward literary. But when I experience things, I tend to, in my head, think about how that can apply to a science fiction or fantasy setting. So if I'm on vacation somewhere and I see something really cool, I'm like, what if this was a planet, or what if this was a world, or what if this, or what if that? And I think it's a lot of asking what ifs about things that you're experiencing in your life, So I tend to write down all of these little random things a lot. So I keep a notebook. I keep also a shiny ideas folder on my computer all the time. And I just throw in all kinds of random, it doesn't have to be organized, just anything that's interesting. Like, for example, I met somebody at one point while I was traveling who was another writer, and he was this big bear of a man, just very could probably survive in the wild. You know, he was just a strong, like manly man, but like was incredibly good at wrapping Christmas presents. Like that was his thing. Like he was so good at it. He like made a tutorial for it for some women's magazine, and he will like make these incredible Christmas gift creations that take him like an hour to do with like 3D origami coming off of it or whatever. And I'm like, that's amazing and so interesting and odd. And so I just remember going home, you know, to the hotel room and writing that down. It's like, this is an interesting character trait. And so I just kind of take little shiny things here and there from what I'm experiencing day to day, people that I talk to, things that I read, all of that can go into an idea. So I think a lot of it is being like a magpie, just like collecting things. And then at some point, I think one of those things shines brighter and longer than everything else. And you find yourself thinking about it constantly. And that's the one. Like that is the idea. And sometimes it can take a few weeks or a few months, you know, for you to realize that that's the one. But I think you'll know instinctively, because you're like, I've been thinking about this one particular character trait for a while, or I've been imagining this one scene in my head for a while. And eventually that is the seed from where a bigger story can grow. And I think your subconscious knows that just from all of the random stuff you've accumulated. But a lot of idea making is accumulating stuff, like putting stuff in the creative well until you've got a big enough creative well to draw from. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go back and transcribe your answer, because it totally validates my process, which is pretty similar to yours. It's really about, I loved your magpie analogy. Just collecting all this, I don't know, just this stuff, shiny objects is a good way to put it. And I've read several definitions of creativity that say it is about that collection and that mixing and that remixing, you know, and that something new or different or wonderful comes out of it somehow. So that's super interesting. I'm intrigued. I was just glancing at some of the chat, and I think I saw somebody say that their parents wanted them to read more nonfiction than fiction. And I hear that a lot from parents or teachers. And I always think you can learn just as much about the world through fiction, because everything is storytelling. And I'm curious about you, because you also, your fantasy novels, sometimes people think fantasy novels don't have anything to do with the real world. And yours do, right? Yours are influenced by what's happening in the world and even the politics of what's happening. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, honestly, all fantasy and science fiction, the entire foundation of fantasy and science fiction is the exaggeration of what's really happening in the real world. You know, so the entire category is dedicated to making literal metaphors about our world. So yeah, it couldn't be farther from the truth that, you know, science fiction and fantasy is based on reality. And it's the way that you use fantasy and science fiction to understand something about society. And for me, it's a way for me to explore something about the world or something about people that is keeping me up at night, or is making me, you know, it's kind of haunting me. Like that's usually what leads to a new sci-fi fantasy story for me. When I was writing Legend, this was back in the year 2009, and, you know, Obama had been elected for about a year or so, and you could kind of feel there was this undercurrent of tension in the political world where, you know, one party was pushing off to the deep end, and Gabby Giffords was shot that year. There was like a lot of political tension happening, and you could see the beginning of the fractures of our political system. And I remember thinking that was what was keeping me up at night at the time. So I remember, like, my what if question was like, what if, you know, this kind of tension literally splits the US in two, you know, like, what if we really did build a wall between, you know, going vertically up between the West and the Eastern half of the US, and what if, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. A lot of real life dystopia went into that series. You know, things that I remember from China, things that I remember from, you know, reading about, you know, in North Korea, things from the US, all of that went into building the world of Legend. And so there's really nothing in any of my books except for maybe, magical powers, that hasn't happened already in reality or isn't happening now. It's just putting like a funhouse mirror on it and exaggerating, punching up certain things to make a point, and structuring the world in a way to enhance this one societal issue that we're trying to talk about. So I think a lot of science fiction and fantasy is like that. I think I've learned more about our world today from science fiction and fantasy than from anything else that I've read, nonfiction, that I've read. And it helps me understand, what's happening in the world.
I keep meaning to make a big list of all the great dystopian sci-fi fantasy books, novels that we always refer to in moments of crisis in order to understand them, and they're so important for us as human beings. I saw somebody saying that in the chat that they particularly like your books because you offer this window of empathy as well. Yeah. And I love the way that you keep referring to that back to that magical question, what if, which really is the magic wand one holds over the world and stories. And we have a real ongoing, eternal conversation in NaNoWriMo. I guess this happens in every writing community. Everybody wants to unlock the secret key of the novel. And so people talk about how much or how one plans, or if you're a pantser planner or I'm a plantser. I'm somewhere in between the two, I think. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about that. Is it mainly how you talked, I guess, more about the idea collection part? Yeah. What about, do you write outlines, or how do you go about structuring your novel, especially with a series, right?
Yeah. I love that term, plantser. I hadn't heard that before. I love it. It's really cool that that's your process, because that's my process now as well. When I first started, I was very much 100% pantser. Like, I just had a spark and I would just start drafting, and it worked out, but it was very messy. And I think it gave me more anxiety than I wanted with my stories. I have a lot of friends who are 100% pantsers, so different methods for everybody, of course. Right. At some point, my friend Amy Kaufman and I were talking about process, and she was watching me in this kind of transitional phase of where I was trying to put some structure into my idea before I began drafting. And she was like, "Oh, you're a headlights writer. You outline as far as the headlights on your car can expose, and then you stop, and then you write, and then you go on." And I was like, "Oh, that's a good term, good way of putting it." So I guess I would be a headlights writer, a plantser. I tend to, before I begin my story, get to know my characters as well as I can. Usually my ideas, my what if is a person. So for Legend, it was, I was watching Les Mis on TV and like the movie version, the old movie version. And I was like, what if this was like a teen story about a teen detective versus a teen criminal? And that was my seed. And from there, I make very, very detailed character profiles. I don't tend to write detailed plot outlines, but I do tend to try to know as much about my characters as I possibly can, down to like their blood types or whatever. Like trivia.
You need to know that these days for the pandemic, right?
Right? Yeah, with COVID, it's actually quite useful to know. But I would write these very, very long character profiles about them, and then when I felt like I got a really good handle on who my main cast was, I would write these like white room scenes where it was mostly just dialogue. I would throw like 2 or 3 characters into a white room and just kind of see what happens between them. Maybe 2 people would fall in love. Maybe 2 people would start fighting, and just kind of get a read for what they would be like. And from there, I would, like, little scenes would start coming to me, and then I would start world building. World building actually comes kind of weirdly late for me. So I will build up maybe like half of the world at that point, and then I feel like I have enough stuff to start drafting. I'll start writing a first draft. I try to outline out like 2 or 3 chapters at a time. So I will outline out 2 or 3 chapters, and then draft those 2 or 3 chapters, and then do it again. And I've found that for me, that works out well, because I kind of know where I'm going, but I don't end up wasting an entire outline because my characters have gone off somewhere, off the tracks, and now I have to restructure everything again. So I kind of do that and eventually find out where I'm going with them. And then after I finish the first draft, I tend to, as I'm writing the first draft, I tend to figure out the rest of my world building. The second half of the world building comes in as I'm figuring out the story itself. So it's a lot of starting and stopping and starting and stopping.
Yeah. I love it because you start with character, and they always, we read for character, right? That's what really engages us, and character creates action, of course. But I love how it is a type of planning. It's just not necessarily planning out all the beats of the plot, right? It's more like letting it organically, flow.
Yeah. Like letting yourself have enough organization to allow the organic stuff to flow.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. So I've never written a series, so I'm just totally ignorant with this. I don't know how one would even go about it. But do you? I mean, does the whole series progress that way, or do you have some idea of a trajectory for 3 books?
Yeah, series are rough. I don't know if I would recommend it. Every single time I start a series, I'm like, why am I doing this to myself again? It's just hard to think about a story that goes on that long for me. So for Legend, because that was my first series, I was much more haphazard about it. I didn't actually know what was going to happen at the very, very end. I had a couple of different scenarios that were going through my head. All I knew was what would happen at the end of book 1 and maybe what was going to happen at the end of book 2. And I didn't actually know what the series ending would be until I was pretty much halfway done with the second book. And that was when it came to me. So that one was very kind of like pantsed, and I'm just kind of lucky the pieces fit together from previous books. Similar things happen with the young elites, but for me, I kind of go back to relying on a general character arc to carry me through. And I know I might not know exactly what needs to happen plot-wise by the end of the 3rd book in a trilogy, but I will kind of know that this main character needs to end up at this mental space by the end of this series. This person needs to, maybe if they start off the story very angry and not confident in themselves, they need to get to a point where they are at the end. With the young elites, Adelina was a character that started off very angry and angry at the world and lashes out at the world. I knew that at the end of the young elite series, she needed to get to a point where she came to terms with who she was as a person and reckoned with all the things that she had done to the world. So that's what I kind of follow as I go, and I trust my subconscious maybe sometimes more than I should to get to a point where I will figure out what plot to match up with that arc's ending.
That's great, because it really is a process of that balancing act between your conscious logical mind and your subconscious intuitive feel and trusting that. This next question comes from Caleb, and I was going to say I think we could probably touch on world building as well, because I see people talking about naming cities and stuff in chat. So since you mentioned how your world building grows from one draft to the next, I'd love you to touch on that. But Caleb asks about the building of the intricacies of a story, and he asks, what are some good ways to create background or a large basis idea for your story? For instance, if you have a character who you want to be part of a secret operation, how would you come up with the details of everything that is included in that, like the company, operator, rival companies, ways of accomplishing tasks, etc.? He says, I just have a few fragments of an idea that I need to expand on, but I'm not sure how I will use them to create an entire believable idea. So I think he's getting that world building there a bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question with a whole bunch of little bits of world building in there already. Yeah, I think, again, for me, it always goes back to character. I think it helps to ask oneself what your main character's goal is to be part of this secret operation. What exactly do you want her or him to get out of this secret operation? Or are they using him as a spy? Are they using him as an agent? What is the end goal for the operation, and what is the end goal for your character, and are they at odds with each other? If so, who is involved in the operation? That might be his or her ally, or their their friend. And then from knowing that about the character and knowing where they need to end up, I think you can start to build out pieces of the operation that need to exist to support what the character needs to do. It will probably involve doing a lot of random research about secret operations, like what does the military do with a secret operation, and what did the mafia do with secret operations, and I'm kind of just speaking in general terms of not knowing what the operation is, but that's how I would approach something like that, and it can be really hard because I don't know what it's like to be a spy or a secret agent. And sometimes you just have to make it up. But that's part of the research process. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you do a fair amount of research then?
It depends on the book, but yeah, I would say so. For fantasy, I feel like I have a little bit more freedom to do whatever, but it helps for me to read historical nonfiction about what life was like, in whatever era I'm trying to mirror in my fantasy. For the Kingdom of Back, since that was actual historical fiction, that one required the most research out of anything that I've done, just because I was writing about real people, the Mozarts, and I was like, okay, I need to probably do some research about the Mozarts to make sure that I'm like getting their lives and their travels and life in 18th century Europe correct. So there was a lot more research for that book.
Yeah. I find one of the tricks with research is that a lot, and I've heard this from other writers, is that once you do the research, which for me is really fun, I could probably just research novels for the rest of my life, actually. But it's easy to get wedded to the research and to want to use it all because it becomes so interesting. How do you create that balancing act of what's good for the story or what's what you have to cut, unfortunately?
Yeah. Info dumping is something that I did a lot of early on, and I still kind of do it sometimes when I'm in a first draft mode. For me, it helps for me to write a first draft, at least from the point of view of my reader knowing everything there is to know already about this world. So I just pretend that my reader knows this world the way that I do, and I'll just start writing it and not reference like, by the way, I need to explain what this thing is or why they do that or this cultural element. I just kind of put it in. And so my first draft tend to make no sense to anybody because I don't put in those bits of world building. And then when I go back in a second draft, that's when I tend to start adding in things like, oh, I think that they won't understand this scene without me adding in this line here or this line here. And it's all about trying to wrap in those explanations with something that's happening in your plot or something that's some kind of character development that's happening with your character. Like if there's some cultural thing that you have to explain in your fantasy world, is there a way that you can show that in a scene that's happening? Is your protagonist doing this thing, this cultural thing, or being involved in it in some way, as opposed to a giant block of text from, my world building doc that says like, oh, 5,000 years ago, they did this ceremony. Like it's a lot of, for me, putting in as little of it as you can possibly manage and still get the story and the richness across for your reader while making it not confusing for them. Yeah. So it's a lot of layers and a lot of drafts to get that.
Yeah, a lot of judgment calls.
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt our interview just briefly because I realize I should have mentioned this. I had in my notes to mention at the beginning, but this is our book, Brave the Page, which is part of our Young Writers Program. It came out last year, and Viking very generously donated 75 copies, and they're included as the donor goodies in donations of $50 or more, including monthly donations. So just want to make sure people are aware of that, and you can go to our website and click on the donate button to do that. There's also a donate button here on the webcast as well. So I just wanted to mention that since this is part of the fundraising drive. But the more interesting part of the fundraising drive is talking with Marie about writing. So I'll return to that. And since we were talking about characters, Twins asks, what are your tips on creating characters that stick with the readers? That's the $1 million question.
Yeah. That's a hard question to answer, because I've been talking to a friend of mine about something that we call id. Like, so there's the id and the ego, and I kind of split books into either id books or ego books. And what it means is like ego books are kind of like books that are intellectually amazing. And I've read a lot of those, and they are intellectually, like, my brain knows these are amazing books. And id books is just, it hits you right in the feels, and you know exactly when you read an id book. Like, when I, like for example, when I started the Hunger Games, I was like, this is hitting all of my id points, you know, with the characters. Twilight, for a lot of people, was an id book. You know, it is just pure, like, you just know when you read this book that these are characters that you need to see through this story, and they have that addictive quality. It's that K-drama quality, you know, where you're just like, I just have to get to the next episode. I think that is always the magic that we're looking for when we are creating stories. So I think for the writer, creating characters that stick with readers like that, id characters, I think takes a little bit of exploration of what your id is, because everyone's id is a little bit different, you know. For me, I am a sucker for characters like who are thieves with a heart of gold. Like, I just can't get enough of those characters, like Robin Hood, Han Solo, like those types of characters. I'm in it. Like, when I see that character on the page, I'm like, I'm locked in on you. So I knew, like, these, so I make a list of things like that. I'm like, these are the things that hit my id, you know, like, these are the buttons that just make me want to keep reading, that make me want to keep experiencing a story. And that will be what you are the most interested in writing about. You know, you personally as a writer are going to want to see this character through all of these things. And you know, a lot of id is very, like, kind of broad strokes, tropey, you know, things, but that can be your starting point from where you begin the blueprint for a great character. And then from there, you can add in, you know, all the little random quirks and shiny things that you've kind of accumulated in your folders and in your notebooks about, maybe he's also really good at wrapping Christmas gifts, or maybe he's this or that, or here's another character that is a great foil for this character. And great characters are nothing without a cast. So, you know, it's all about the relationship between two great characters. That's where the magic really happens in a story, how they conflict with each other and clash with each other and fall in love or whatever. So it's a lot of feeling it out. That's why it's such a hard question to answer, because it's not really like a blueprint to follow. It's you feeling out what makes you want to follow a character through, because you feel it, you know, other people will feel it.
That was a super great answer. I love that id versus ego character. It just is a lens or a filter to look at books and characters. And, you know, sometimes when we're talking with people who are deciding if they're going to do NaNoWriMo or what they're going to write about, you know, we do tell them to make a list of their favorite books. Yeah. You know, the whole thing, you want to write what you love, or the book that you think should be on the bookshelf. But that's a great too, because I think I don't think I've heard anyone exactly answer that question that way. I think sometimes people think that it is some algorithm to come up with the perfect character. But you're making it's really personal. And I'm imagining to carry it off, you've got to make yourself somewhat vulnerable on the page as well. You got to really put your heart in that character. For
sure. Yeah. And I mean, I didn't come up with the idea. It was definitely like something that I learned from other writers that I know, but I find it incredibly useful.
Yeah, super useful.
Yeah.
Paulina Kowalchuk, I hope I pronounced that right, and apologies if I didn't. She asked a characterization question as well, and she asks, are there any stereotypes in writing that you wish people would acknowledge or change?
That's a great question. Stereotype, I guess, like, stereotype could mean tropes, I guess. And I don't think I have anything against any specific trope, because all trope is rooted in id, you know, so it's somebody's id. So that's why it's in the story. Like, it's the Superman jump, you know, like we're like, how many times are we going to see a superhero land on one knee with crack in the ground? Like, that's the thing, right? But people love it. So that's why it's there. And that's why it becomes a trope and a stereotype. So in that sense, and in the sense of, like, elements of storytelling, I don't think there's anything that I really think people shouldn't use, because, you know, lean into your id. I think it's fine. In lots of genres kind of thrive on having those types of stereotypes. Like, romance is going to have a happily ever after. Like, that's what readers look for when they read romance. And so in that sense, it doesn't bother me. I guess stereotypes that I would like to see less of would obviously be more in relation to people. Whenever people are tackling writing characters about, characters who are coming from backgrounds different from themselves, that needs to be handled with great care and thought. And I think that that's something that all of us can work to improve. It's something that is a learning process for me as well. Like there's a lot of cases where if I look back on my older writing, I can see generalizations I've made about certain groups of people or characters that I know better now not to do, or that I was stereotyping in a certain way. And it can be really, really subtle things that are hard for you to tell. But, you had mentioned making yourself vulnerable. And I think this is an area where writers need to make themselves vulnerable in order to reckon with blind spots that we have in terms of, seeing people from a different race or a culture or gender identity. And if you're going to put those people in your story, you have to make yourself aware of your own blind spots and then go out and seek out things to correct that blind spot and put that into those characters. Because otherwise, if a writer's not willing to do that, I don't think they should put those characters in at all.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to do it, try to do it right. And it's not to say that we'll always get it right, but with time comes learning and you improve. So I think that's probably the stereotypes that I would hope that we all work to lessen.
That's great. That's really empowering. I talked with Daniel Jose Older once, and he wrote an article. I think it was 10 or 12 rules of writing. Well, I think the title of it was Writing the Other, or putting yourself into the other, as he put it. And so he was, but one of them was, you've got to just do it. You've got to, but you can't do it just unwisely or unthoughtfully, so that's what the other 11 things are about that. So thank you for that. I wanted to say, sometimes people think that writing comes easy to writers once they're published, that everything's like, how to be a writer. And I know that you mentioned this earlier, that every book is its own particular challenge. So I'm just curious, do you have pangs of self-doubt that are reminiscent of when you might have been 20 or 18 as a writer, or do you get over those and develop more confidence and think know that you can do it?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I really wish it got better over time. I feel like I'm, in a lot of ways, I still have very similar anxiety about, the next book. And like I said, I will always, without fail, hit that part in every book where I'm just like, oh my God, this is the worst thing that I've ever written. This is the worst draft. My editor is going to cancel my contract. I am going to, I'm never going to write a book again. Like, that has never gone away for me. I just went through this actually I just turned in a first draft like a few weeks ago. So I just went through this fresh mental torture. And really the only difference is just that I know that I'm going to experience that moment in the book, So I'm like, okay, here it comes. This is my 3 months of incredibly crippling self-doubt where I just don't think that this book is going to ever work. And at some point I know I will be over this. And that's really the only hang on to, while I'm working on a draft. I just know I'm like, this too shall pass. And someday I will look back on this as like, remember when that draft was so hard? And then you kind of forget about it, because you get to a point where you do like your book, even though it takes a long time. So yeah.
I like this too shall pass. We should make NaNoWriMo stickers. Say that, I think. That's interesting. I was curious why when you said that you just turned in a manuscript, and I know we always there's that type of feedback that comes from an agent or an editor, but are you a person who seeks feedback before you turn in that final manuscript? Do you have a group of friends perhaps that you show it to, or do you have a writing community that you turn to in any way?
I don't tend to show my first drafts to anybody. I think, and everyone's different. For me, I feel very vulnerable about my ugly baby.
Yeah, me too. I don't either.
Yeah, now that I'm published, when you sell a new book, you tend to give first 3 chapters, to sell it. So in that sense, I will show my agent the first 3 chapters of a book. But aside from my agent and my editor seeing the first 3 chapters, once I get the green light, I'm just in the hole for the entire first draft. And I will usually do one pass of a heavy revision on my book after the first draft before I end up giving it to my editor, just because I cannot stomach the idea of giving her this unpolished first draft, which makes absolutely no sense. So yeah, otherwise I feel like I will lose all emotional affection for this book, because it's just, I can't handle anyone saying anything about Ugly Baby before it gets out, into the world. So yeah, I'm very protective of that first draft.
Yeah. I saw some gasps and oh my gods and a lot of exclamation points when they heard that you've got a new book coming out. Is it premature to do any sort of preview of it? I don't want to put you on the spot. I really hate talking about my books before they're ready. So only if you want to. Yeah,
no worries. I've got a new first book in a new sci-fi series coming out this fall, September 29th. It's called Skywalker. Yeah, and it is it's sci-fi set far in the future, maybe like 5,000 years in the future, but it's in a regressed society. So people have forgotten where they came from. They've forgotten the advanced civilization that came before them and have now regressed. And it's about this federation that has taken over pretty much every country in the world except for one tiny country called Mara. And it's about this girl named Talon, who is one of the elite warriors in Mara who are trained to fight back against the Federation. And it's her story. It's about being a refugee from one of the nations that fell to the Federation and how she still fights for this country called Mara, even though Mara doesn't treat her and her people that well. But that she's a soldier for them nevertheless. And it's about her found family that she finds with the other warriors in her patrols. And about this boy named Red that she finds one day. And he is a prisoner of war who fled from the Federation. And she's not really sure if he's a spy or an enemy or if he's actually the weapon that they've all been waiting for. So it's the longest book that I've ever written and probably the hardest one that I've ever written. So I went really through the ringer with this one, but I hope people like it if they get a chance to read it.
I think I see one. Oh, hell yeah. Found family. Ooh, boy. I think we're getting some good reactions here. You can pass them on to your editor.
I will. Thank you.
I had a few of those internalized reactions myself. I love that relationship that I forget the names actually, but the one character doesn't quite know who the other character is, like a spy or weapon or friend. Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Well, we're going to go back to talking about writer's angst a little bit because that's always a popular topic. Christine asks, what do you do about writer's block? How do you get out of your head and put your ideas and thoughts onto paper? I used to be such a prolific writer, but then something happened. Life, stress, age, I don't know. How do I get back to normal? It's a big question.
I feel that question like right in my bones because especially now during the pandemic, I feel like we've all, or many of us have experienced like a change in our mental state or change in our actual day-to-day, that makes it difficult to be creative. And there's no real easy answer for it, except that I feel you, it's, being creative requires sinking into such a deep mental state, and it can be quite hard to do that now. I think if you can even carve out a few minutes a day to yourself of self-care where you just let yourself sink into that deep mental state, and it can be, it sounds a little bit like meditation. It can be just something that gives you that moment of peace. I think that is helpful. I think that forcing yourself to write when you are genuinely exhausted can be kind of fruitless. So when I sense those moments, I try to carve out some time for myself where I'm not writing and I'm not doing any of that. I'm just focusing on self-care and something that is going to get me into like a healthy mental state to write. Yeah. And I'm sorry I'm moving. I'm grabbing my charger because my laptop's about to die. But, that's what I would do. Yeah. And I hope she finds that place for herself.
Yeah, me too. It's always tough to give advice on writer's block questions, and I appreciate what you said about exhaustion. We, in NaNoWriMo, we're kind of set up to help people get over writer's block. So yeah, I'll just recommend signing up for NaNoWriMo and taking part in our programs and reading pep talks from Marie. Actually wrote a pep talk several years ago for NaNoWriMo. We have a whole collection of them on the website, so maybe those can help as well. You might have answered this question earlier when you were talking about the difference. Oh, should I let you get all plugged in? I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay.
I just got my thing, so I'm about to plug in.
Okay.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm kind of distracted right now.
No, this is like a casual webcast. Anything goes. Yeah, Greta asks, what do you think separates good books from really good books? And what makes them different or sets them apart from everything else? I'm not sure if you touched on this in the id and ego answer, but if you have anything to add or a different angle.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm settled
Take
down.
your time. I'll do more plugs for Brave the Page while you're
No, I'm good now.
Yeah,
that's a really great question. What separates a good book from a great book? For me, I think it goes back to id. You know, there's certain books where I can read it and I have a great time reading them. I know that they've given me a lot of enjoyment and there's nothing wrong with those books. And for another person, they might be in the category of a great book. For me, a great book is when for me, it hits those feelings, you know, all those id feelings. And then at the end of the book, I close it with this deep, deep sense of satisfaction. And I find myself, you know, over the span of months and years, still thinking about what I had read in those books. And those books are really rare. You know, I think it's rare for everybody to have those moments where you just, and sometimes it will take years for me to realize that a good book was a great book, you know?
Yeah.
So it's, it's kind of just reading widely and going back after reading widely and thinking that book really holds up. And that book is something that I'm thinking about constantly. And that book has changed my perspective of the world in some way. So
that's it. Yeah, that's what I think. You don't know often, as you said, when you're done with the book.
Yeah.
It can take years as you kind of keep referring to it.
Yeah.
Nicole asked 2 questions, very publishing-oriented question, and I wanted to make sure that we answered them because I could tell with 2 questions on her mind, it's very important. I guess I'll actually ask them together since they're kind of related. The one question is, what publishing process, traditional or self-publishing, would you recommend for young authors? And then her other question is, what's the most important step to get an agent to represent your book? So yeah.
Yeah, and it's always great to hear from young writers who are thinking about like the publication side of things. You know, it is a business and it's important to understand the business. In terms of getting an agent, I think it helps a little bit to know what kind of category you are envisioning your book to go into. When I first started submitting, I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that I had written fantasy. Like that much I knew. So then I started doing research about who the agents were for all of my favorite fantasy authors and who represented them. And from there, I kind of collected this list of names of people that I thought would be good to submit to. I tried to pick agents that represented books that were similar to my book and represented authors for whom I thought my career, I would like my career to emulate. So that's what I was doing. I would say the most important thing in terms of looking for an agent is to make sure that they're reputable, because a bad agent is definitely worse than no agents. Bad agents can set you back. Bad agents can be scammers, you know. So be careful who you find. That's why I think it's very helpful to find out who represents the established authors that you know, or an author that you've seen published, because those people tend to be reputable agents already. Also check to see if they belong to the AAR, the author, what does it stand for? The author representative something. But there's like a, it's like an organization that has like a code of conduct and honor, and they kind of, like if your agent belongs to that, then it's considered good that they are a legit agent. And I'm sorry, there was a second part of that question that I'm missing.
Well, there's the traditional publishing or self-publishing part of the question. Yeah. These days, I think it's a really interesting question, because it really depends on what kind of
writer you are and what you feel comfortable doing. So I think all the avenues are actually very valid. It just depends on how you want to be published. And there are so many stories of self-published authors who find great success, because maybe they have a story that is so unusual and weird that they couldn't get past, traditional publishing. And, of course, plenty of people have gone through the traditional publishing. Like, you don't have to know anyone. I didn't know anyone. You don't need connections,
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I just sent out query letters cold,
So you did the research and you had a list of agents that were your desired agents and you just queried them. Was there one thing about the query letter that you learned that was really important to do that you'd advise others? Yeah,
keep it short. I remember when I first started submitting them, they were like 2 pages long. This was back when you actually sent in like a printed letter to agencies, and try to keep it to 1 page. I guess an email would be like 2 paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs. One that kind of just very briefly tell them who you are and then tell them what your book is about. It's actually quite straightforward. And
maybe a few comp titles listed as well.
Yeah, maybe like a few comp titles. Like, this is similar to the vein of this and this. And then that's it. Like, you really, unless you have like some really significant writing accolade to include, there's really no need to put it in. Just be like, I really hope you enjoy the book and hope to hear from you. And that's pretty much it. Like, they just want to know what your book is about.
Well, the one thing I'll add is that I've talked to some writers who they will send it out to 3 or 4 agents and they'll get no's back or they won't hear back, and then they'll totally give up. And I want them to know that sometimes it takes many, many, many rejections, and that rejection is part of being an author. And sometimes you just have to wade through like literally tens of rejections. I always like to tell the story of Marlon James, who actually received 73 rejections for his first novel.
Wow.
And he was literally ready to give up. I mean, he did give up for a while, but thank God he didn't. And so, so don't give up after 3 or 4 rejections. That's just the beginning. Sometimes, hopefully not, but sometimes it is. So.
That's very good advice. Yeah.
Well, we're nearing the end of our hour, and Ashley wrote or asked a great question that I think is great to close on, because I want to leave people with some motivational energy. Hopefully to actually, you can still sign up for Camp NaNoWriMo if you haven't signed up. So if you're not doing Camp NaNoWriMo, please sign up. Otherwise, take part in our other programs. You can set up your own word count goals and tracking process for any writing project on the site. And you can also start getting ready for NaNoWriMo. But Ashley writes, what motivates you to keep writing?
That's a great question. I would say every book that I've ever written is a snapshot of who I was as a person at the time that I wrote it. And I can look back at my old writing and remember exactly who I was at the time, exactly what bothered me, what my fears were. It's in a way, it's for me like journaling. It's an understanding of who you are. And for me, it is my way of making sense of myself. It's my way of making sense of the world around me. And I think that there is a lot of value in sharing that part of you with the world. So I think that's what motivates me to keep writing, because I would like to keep growing as a person. And I think that writing is something that helps me do that. And I find so much inspiration in the world around me, in the people that I see every day, especially the young people, especially now. I feel like every day there's a new story about young people doing incredible, extraordinary things, many times that they shouldn't have to be doing. Young people should be free to grow up and not have all of these heavy things weighing on them. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. But young people are just, in spite of all of that, they are taking the future in their own hands, and they are, making great things happen. And I find that an incredible source of inspiration. And I feel the need to document that, So it's my way of making sense of myself, and my way of pointing out what both scares me and inspires me in the world. Yeah.
That is such a great answer. And it makes me think of our Young Writers Program, which didn't exist when I was growing up and was a teen and writing. And I didn't even think about writing a novel until I was in my late 20s. And I think that NaNoWriMo, the thing I love about it is it opens the door for so many people. And I'll talk to teens and they've written, 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 7 or 8 novels. And sometimes they've self-published them. More and more, they're actually traditionally publishing them as well. And not that it's all about publishing, though, because I think what touches me most is I think what you're getting at, just the inspiration from people doing big things and believing in themselves. And the NaNoWriMo writers who write with a sense of joy. And as you said, like for me too, like if I don't write, I get cranky. I think it's because I'm just not, I need that bit of writing to make sense of the world and to ground me somehow. And that's just whatever, that's what I need. That's my, I guess, form of meditation or whatever. So thanks for leaving us with that message. And thanks for all of your writing wisdom. This has been a really, really interesting talk for me. And I know it has been for everybody else based on the chat, which has been just like a ticker tape or something.
You guys are amazing. Thank you guys for, this was so fun, Grant. It was so nice to talk to you and to hear about, bits of your process as well. So yeah, thank you for having me on. This was really fun.
Here's to planters.
Planters.
And planners and pantsers.
Yes, to all of you.
Go forward, everyone. Thanks so much. I see a lot of
everybody. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.